On July 4, 1946, more than 200,000 people gathered on a hill near the city of Gdansk, Poland. In front of them, 11 ropes hung from makeshift gallows mounted on military trucks. At the signal, the vehicles drove off, dumping the bodies of the condemned until there was absolute silence. 5 of those executed were women. All had served as guards at the Stutthof concentration camp. Some were young, almost teenagers. They had no military experience, no relevant rank, but a history of sadism, bureaucratic efficiency, and unquestioning loyalty to the Nazi system. What drove these young women to commit some of the worst atrocities of the century? What did they find in a concentration camp that turned them into willing murderers? And how did the Allies track them down and make them pay for their crimes? Death marches, the final route to Stutthof. On September 1st, 1939, as German Stukas roared over Warsaw, a seemingly minor decision was being made in the swamps near Danzig. The local German authorities, without waiting for orders from Berlin, began construction of an internment camp at Stutthof, a wooded, isolated area 36 kilometers east of the city. Its German name would be Stutthof. The location was no coincidence. Surrounded by the Baltic Sea to the north, Gdansk Bay to the west, and the Vistula Lagoon to the east, the site offered perfect natural isolation. The surrounding swamps and forests created a natural barrier, while river and sea routes allowed for the discreet transport of prisoners. It was a fortress of water and land that would soon become a tomb for tens of thousands. The first prisoners arrived on September 2nd, just 24 hours after the invasion. They were members of the Polish elite, university professors, Catholic priests, civil servants, intellectuals. The objective was clear: to decapitate Polish society by eliminating its natural leaders. During these first months, Stutthof functioned as a political internment camp, but its true nature would soon be revealed. In October 1939, the camp showed its most sinister face. Under the orders of SS officer Kurt Eimann, more than 3,500 psychiatric patients were transported from hospitals in Pomerania and Danzig to the forests near Neustadt. Stutthof's Polish prisoners were forced to dig mass graves under threat of death. Once the work was completed, Eimann's men executed the patients by shooting them in the back of the head. Afterward, the same prisoners who had dug the graves were murdered to eliminate witnesses. It was a rehearsal for extermination, a test of what was to come. The official transformation came in January 1942, when Heinrich Himmler personally visited the camp. Impressed by the facility's efficiency and strategic isolation, he ordered Stutthof's official categorization as a concentration camp. New barracks, a crematorium, and a gas chamber were built. The wheels of extermination were beginning to turn. During 1943 and 1944, Stutthof underwent dramatic expansion. More than 40 subcamps were added, each specializing in different forms of labor exploitation. The construction of a specific camp for women marked a turning point. The SS began recruiting German guards, young women trained in Nazi ideology who would soon demonstrate that cruelty knew no gender. The summer of 1944 brought with it a human avalanche. With the collapse of the ghettos in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, thousands of Jewish prisoners were deported to Stutthof. The so-called death marches began, endless columns of starving and exhausted people walking for days under the brutal surveillance of guards. Many died along the way, but those who arrived faced an even worse fate. By the end of the summer, more than 60,000 people were crammed into the main camp and its subcamps. Among them, at least 20,000 were Jewish women evacuated from Auschwitz-Birkenau. Conditions were inhumane. Barracks designed for 50 people housed 200. Diseases spread like plagues, and death became so commonplace that crematoriums operated day and night. The Stutthof gas chamber was operating at full capacity. On the most intense days, up to 150 people were murdered in a single day. Selections were made every morning. Weak, sick, or simply randomly selected prisoners were separated from the rest and led to their deaths. The process was bureaucratic, efficient, and lethal. When the Red Army began its final westward advance in January 1945, camp authorities ordered new death marches. This time, the goal was to evacuate prisoners into the German interior. On January 25th, the exodus began. Nearly 50,000 people were forced to walk toward Lauenburg in extreme weather conditions. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and many prisoners walked barefoot in the snow. Death accompanied every step of these marches. Those who fell were executed immediately. There was no food, barely any water, and the guards showed total indifference to the suffering. Some columns were intercepted by Soviet troops, forcing the Germans to change their route. Other groups reached the Baltic coast, where they were shipped off in deplorable conditions to other camps. It is estimated that more than 25,000 people died during these evacuations, some from hypothermia, others from starvation, many executed by guards, and thousands drowned when ships were intentionally sunk or mistakenly attacked by Allied forces. The death marches were not evacuations, they were exterminations in motion. On May 9, 1945, 2 days after the German surrender, Soviet troops arrived at Stutthof. They found a desolate landscape. Only 100 prisoners had managed to hide and survive. The crematorium ovens were still warm, and the gas chamber showed signs of having been partially demolished with explosives. The Nazis had tried to erase the evidence but were unsuccessful. Soviet soldiers meticulously photographed the facilities, documented the human remains found, and collected testimony from survivors. This evidence would be crucial in the subsequent trials. In the camp archives, they found personnel lists, photographs of guards, and documents revealing the organizational structure of the extermination. Stutthof had operated uninterrupted for 5 years and 8 months. Of the more than 110,000 prisoners who passed through its facilities, at least 65,000 died. It was one of the last camps to be liberated, and its history remained largely hidden for decades, overshadowed by better-known camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. But in its silent swamps lay an essential part of the Nazi genocidal machinery, and in its archives, the names of those who operated it. League of German Girls, how the Reich's executioners were forged. The seed of evil did not germinate overnight in Nazi Germany. It was carefully planted in childhood, watered with propaganda, and cultivated into fanaticism. At the center of this cultivation of hatred was the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, an organization that transformed ordinary girls into ideological soldiers of the Third Reich. Founded in 1930 as the female branch of the Hitler Youth, the BDM operated under a simple but devastating premise: to capture young minds before they could develop critical thinking. Beginning in March 1939, enrollment became mandatory for all 10-year-old German girls. It was the beginning of a systematic indoctrination that would last into adulthood. The organizational structure was militarily precise. The Jung Mädelbund for girls aged 10 to 14, the BDM proper until age 18, and finally the BDM Werk, Glaube und Schönheit for the adult female elite. Each stage intensified the process of ideological transformation. The educational program combined physical activity, racial indoctrination, and domestic preparation under a central philosophy. Feminine value lay in racial purity, reproductive capacity, and absolute obedience to the state. The BDM yearbooks were sophisticated propaganda tools that combined images of smiling young women with doctrinal texts and portraits of Hitler. Music played a hypnotic role in this process. Hymns like Wir sind die frohe Hitlerjugend were sung daily, creating a devastating psychological effect. Entire generations grew up singing their own subservience. Gertrude Scholz-Klink, supreme leader of the Reich's women's organizations, articulated the perfect synthesis. The German woman was to be simultaneously a devoted mother and an ideological soldier. This seemingly contradictory duality was resolved by a central principle. The enemies of the Reich were not people but existential threats. The outbreak of war in 1939 radically transformed these expectations. Hitler summoned all German women to the combat community, and recruitment offices began searching among BDM graduates for candidates to become SS Helferinnen. Training at camps like Ravensbrück included intensive ideological instruction, extreme physical exercises, and violent control techniques. A complex hierarchical system developed with 12 levels of female authority, from junior supervisors to Oberaufseherinnen. This structure fostered fierce competition. Promotions were awarded for efficiency in repression. These women's roles transcended the administrative. They controlled counts, supervised forced labor, organized selections for gas chambers, and administered corporal punishment. Their proximity to daily suffering turned them into active executioners of the genocidal system. Thus, women who had grown up embroidering tablecloths found themselves administering death with bureaucratic efficiency. The BDM had fulfilled its purpose, creating a generation for whom obedience was more valuable than humanity. Jenny Wanda Bachmann, the impeccable image of administrative horror. She was beautiful, and that beauty made her even more terrifying. Jenny Wanda Bachmann walked through the Stutthof barracks with the elegance of a model and the coldness of an executioner. Her always perfectly combed hair, her lipstick, and her impeccable uniform contrasted starkly with the suffering that surrounded her. For the prisoners, the sight of her meant that death was near, dressed in silk and perfumed with roses. The contrast was not accidental. Born in Hamburg on May 30th, 1922, Bachmann had grown up in a Germany where Nazi propaganda promised greatness and purpose to those who submitted to the Reich. Her childhood was spent in a port city where fascist ideas flourished among unemployed workers and the impoverished middle class. Like many young women of her generation, she found in Nazism not just an ideology, but an identity. Records suggest she aspired to be a fashion model. Her beauty was undeniable, and in the 1930s Germany, the entertainment industry offered outlets for ambitious young women. But the war changed all expectations. By 1944, when she was 21, glamour had given way to brutality and the catwalks had become extermination camps. It was then that she applied to become an SS supervisor. Her arrival at Stutthof coincided with the camp's deadliest period. By then, more than 100,000 people had passed through its facilities, and the extermination system operated with industrial efficiency. Bachmann was assigned to the women's subcamp SK3, where thousands of Jewish and Polish women were exploited as slave labor before being murdered. From the beginning, her behavior defied any expectation that youth or beauty could soften cruelty. The prisoners described her as a theatrical figure who combined narcissistic vanity with pure sadism. She carried her whip coiled on her hip like a fashion accessory, carrying it as casually as other women would carry a handbag. The morning head counts became horror shows under her watch. She forced the women to form perfect lines while she walked among them, striking arbitrarily with her rod. A shifty glance, a tired posture, a gesture of hesitation were enough to unleash a public beating. Her shrill laughter echoed in the courtyard as the victims fell to the ground. During the winter months, his methods became even more sadistic. He forced prisoners to strip naked and stand in the courtyard while he threw buckets of ice-cold water over them. Then, as they shivered uncontrollably, he humiliated them with insults and forced them to hold painful positions for hours. Those who collapsed were sent directly to the gas chamber, but the most disconcerting aspect of her personality was her obsession with appearance. Even in the most brutal environment of the camp, she maintained a meticulous beauty routine. Every morning she styled her hair, applied makeup, and applied perfume. She changed her hairstyle frequently, as if she were preparing for a theatrical performance rather than supervising an extermination camp. This vanity, contrasted with cruelty, led the prisoners to nickname her Der schöne Gespenst, the beautiful spectre. The name perfectly captured the contradiction, an alluring woman who moved among them like an apparition of death. Others called her simply Die verrückte Jenny, Crazy Jenny, for her unpredictable outbursts of violence and theatrical behavior during the selections. The selections were the moment where his sadism reached its purest expression. He walked among the rows of skeletal women with the attitude of someone choosing fruit at a market. He pointed with his finger or his rod at those who should be sent to the gas chamber, sometimes based on apparent medical criteria, but often completely arbitrarily. He seemed to delight in the desperation in his victims' eyes. A Jewish prisoner from Lithuania would recall decades later, "I'll never forget her perfume. She always smelled like roses while she beat us. It was as if death had a sweet scent." This mixture of femininity and brutality created a psychological terror that went beyond physical fear. The prisoners couldn't understand how someone who took such care of her appearance could be so indifferent to the suffering of others. When the Soviet advance made the camp's fall inevitable, Bachmann attempted to escape. She discarded her uniform, acquired false identity papers, and tried to blend in with the displaced German population. For several months, she managed to evade capture, likely aided by her innocent appearance and her ability to manipulate those around her. She was arrested in May 1945 at the Gdansk train station, where she was attempting to flee westward under a completely new identity. Even during her detention, she maintained her obsession with her appearance. The guards who were looking after her reported that she constantly flirted, fixed her hair, and asked for lipstick. It was as if she couldn't grasp that her world of privilege had ended. During the trial held in Gdansk in 1946, her behavior continued to be disconcerting. She showed up every day with a different hairstyle, smiled frequently, and seemed more concerned with her appearance than with the accusations against her. When witnesses recounted the atrocities she had committed, she was seen laughing or making gestures of boredom. Her arrogant attitude provoked outrage even among her own lawyers. She denied some charges but showed no remorse for any. On one occasion, when the prosecutor read the list of children she had sent to their deaths, she was seen smiling slightly. Journalists present described her behavior as that of someone at a theatrical performance rather than on trial for her life. On July 4, 1946, Jenny Wanda Bachmann was executed along with 10 other war criminals in Biskupia Gorka. She was barely 24 years old. As she was taken to the execution ground, she maintained her vain composure until the very end. But at the crucial moment, her truck wouldn't start. The crowd went wild as she stood, still alive, with the noose around her neck. It was then that a former Stutthof prisoner stepped forward from the crowd and pushed her off the truck bed. Jenny Wanda Bachmann died instantly. As her body swayed in the breeze, many people in the crowd reached out to tear off pieces of cloth or buttons as souvenirs. Her body was eventually sent to the anatomical theatre in Danzig, where it was used as teaching material for medical students before being disposed of as biological waste. Parodies, fanatical discipline in the women's blocks. On December 17, 1920, in the snowy streets of Lauenburg, a girl was born who would bear a sadly prophetic surname, Parodies, meaning paradise. Parodies would never know paradise, but she would create hell for thousands of women in the Stutthof subcamps. Her transformation revealed how obedience could turn into sadism when circumstances permitted. Her first 23 years were spent in the provincial Norm, a working-class Protestant family, menial jobs that took her between Wuppertal, Erfurt, and her native Lauenburg. This constant restlessness suggested a search for purpose that would find its most terrifying expression in the summer of 1944, when she volunteered for the SS. Her arrival at the SK3 training camp in Stutthof marked the turning point. Where other candidates needed weeks to adapt to routine violence, Ewa embraced it immediately, standing out for her alarming willingness to apply extreme physical punishment. Her instructors took note of this efficiency. In October 1944, transferred to the Bromberg Ost women's subcamp, she began to develop her personal method. Under her supervision, the morning headcounts transformed into rituals of terror. With her wooden stick, she struck faces and torsos with a precision that denoted growing experience. Her laughter as the victims fell to the ground became the soundtrack to the daily horror. During the cruelest winter of the war, she perfected techniques that went beyond physical violence. Women were forced to strip naked in sub-zero temperatures, while Ewa threw icy water on them, forcing them to remain motionless. Collective punishment became her specialty. Entire barracks suffered for the actions of a single prisoner. When she returned to the main camp in 1945, her role evolved into direct participation in the selections for the gas chambers. Impeccably dressed, she decided fates with the coldness of someone sorting merchandise. She looked at us like animals in a market, one survivor would recall decades later. During the final evacuations, she accompanied transports to Lauenburg that became extermination marches. Her signature appeared on documents condemning hundreds of women to die of starvation on Baltic barges. Her capture in Hamburg, where she was trying to rebuild her life under a false identity, brought her to the Gdansk court. There, her justification was starkly simple. I was just following orders. It was what was expected of me. This trivialization of evil did not move the judges. On July 4, 1946, in Biskupia Gorka, Ewa Parodies faced the crowd demanding justice. Hoodless, with a rope of plant fibers around her neck, she died of strangulation as the military truck moved forward. Her body was donated to medical science. The executioner became an object of study, completing a poetic justice that brought her story to a fitting close. Elizabeth Becker, Youth at the Service of the Death Machine. Youth was no excuse or mitigating factor. Elizabeth Becker was 22 years old when she was publicly hanged, but she bore the responsibility for thousands of deaths. Her case raised uncomfortable questions about youthful culpability and the limits of moral responsibility in the context of systematic genocide. Born on July 20, 1923, in Nowy Stor, she grew up among farmland and the dangerous proximity of the free city of Danzig. At the age of 15, she joined the BDM with a devotion that drew attention even among her most enthusiastic classmates. Her participation between 1938 and 1940 was total. She absorbed Nazi racial ideology as her personal gospel. When Danzig was annexed to the Reich in 1939, she celebrated it as a victory. For Elizabeth, Nazism transcended politics. It was about identity, purpose, and a promising future. While she continued to work in the local agricultural sector, her ideological background marked her as a perfect candidate for SS recruitment. In September 1944, at just 21 years old, she arrived at Stutthof. Her initial role seemed bureaucratic: work lists, barrack assignments, registration of new prisoners. But in the concentration camp world, there was no such thing as innocent work. Every administrative decision had lethal consequences. Elizabeth developed a silent specialty in sorting. Where other supervisors excelled at spectacular violence, she perfected a cold efficiency that was equally deadly. She checked new arrivals with bureaucratic thoroughness, determining destinations with the ease of someone sorting merchandise. She had a blank expression, as if she were counting objects instead of selecting people to die, one witness recalled. This emotional detachment made her a perfect instrument of the genocidal machinery, young, efficient, completely dehumanized. During the final sea evacuations, he assumed crucial logistical responsibilities. He signed embarkation authorizations without guaranteeing basic provisions for the transports. On May 5, 1945, a barge carrying 370 prisoners arrived in Denmark. Only 351 survived. Elizabeth had signed those documents. His arrest sparked an unexpected debate on juvenile criminal responsibility. The court recognized that he had used less direct physical violence than his colleagues, recommending commutation of the death sentence to 15 years in prison. The appeal reached Polish President Bolesław Bierut. The presidential decision was clear. Youth did not absolve moral responsibility when it came to systematic genocide. Bierut rejected the commutation, turning Elizabeth into a symbol of ruthless justice. For some, she represented the punishment Nazi crimes deserved. For others, her execution raised uncomfortable questions about retroactive justice. On the day of her death, Elizabeth was transported with the other condemned men. Reports indicate that she offered no resistance, but her face showed confusion and resignation. She trembled visibly, neither crying nor pleading. She was the youngest of those executed, amplifying the symbolism of the act. Her body met the same fate as her victims, donated to the anatomical theatre in Danzig as teaching material. The media presented her death as a clear warning. The Nazi regime had corrupted even its youngest members. Elizabeth Becker died as she had lived her final years, as a symbol of a generation lost in fanaticism. The death sentence was commuted to 15 years in prison. The appeal reached Polish President Bolesław Bierut, who had final authority over these decisions. In a decision that surprised many observers, Bierut rejected the commutation. His reasoning was clear. Youth could not be an excuse when actions had systematically contributed to the genocidal machinery. Age did not absolve moral responsibility. The presidential decision turned Elizabeth into a symbol. For some, she represented the ruthless justice that Nazi crimes deserved. For others, especially abroad, her execution raised uncomfortable questions about the application of retroactive justice to people who had been teenagers during part of the crimes committed. On the day of her execution, Elizabeth was transported along with the other 10 condemned prisoners to Biskupia Gorka. Reports from the time indicate that she offered no physical resistance, but her face displayed a mixture of confusion and resignation. She was the youngest of all those executed, and this contrast was not lost on the crowd or the press present. Witnesses reported that he was visibly trembling, but he did not cry or plead. When the truck started moving and his body was suspended, he died by slow strangulation like the others. His youth did not alter the method of execution, but it did amplify the symbolism of the act. Justice did not recognize age when it came to crimes against humanity. Her body was sent to the anatomical theatre in Danzig, along with those of her fellow executed women. Polish media presented her death as a clear warning. The Nazi regime had corrupted even its youngest members, and society would not tolerate age as a refuge for impunity. Elizabeth Becker died as she had lived the last years of her life, as a symbol, not as a person. Wonderclaff horror routine. Born Wanda Kalaczynski in 1922 to a German railway family in Danzig, nothing in her early years suggested she would become one of the most brutal figures in the concentration camp system. Her transformation illustrates how war can corrupt seemingly ordinary lives and turn mediocrity into systematic monstrosity. Her biography before 1944 is devoid of obvious political fanaticism. School until 1938, work in a jam factory, marriage to Willy Klaff in 1942, and jobs as a housewife and tram operator. The family's change of surname from Kalaczynski to Kalden in 1941 only reveals the penetration of Nazi racial paranoia into integrated families. His joining the SS in 1944 appears to have been more opportunistic than ideological, a response to the employment opportunities the war had created. This lack of prior fanaticism makes his subsequent brutality all the more puzzling to those seeking simple psychological explanations. Her entry into the Stutthof system came through the Proust and Rusoshin subcamps, which specialized in the exploitation of female prisoners. Without extensive training, she developed her own methods along the way, creating a personal style of cruelty that soon distinguished her among more experienced supervisors. The headcounts became his personal theater of sadism. He organized them whenever he felt like it, transforming each day into a terrifying uncertainty. He could order up to 6 headcounts a day, each an opportunity to unleash violence with his favorite leather whip, beating every woman who left the barracks. The prisoners developed desperate strategies, jumping through windows to avoid the main door. But Wanda interpreted these escapes as personal challenges, responding with escalating violence. After a week under her supervision, each body became a map of bruises and open wounds. His method revealed a personality that found satisfaction in absolute control. He didn't apply blows uniformly. He measured them out, varied them, and personalized them according to his perception of each victim. This variation wasn't random. It constituted a sadistic art form that he enjoyed perfecting. Some prisoners died directly from injuries sustained during these counts. Others, weakened by constant beatings, were classified as unfit and sent to the gas chambers. Thus, she indirectly participated in the extermination through a system that transformed violence into a deferred sentence. She did not hold a high hierarchical rank, but her influence was palpable. Her mere presence was enough to make the inmates shudder, and her reputation circulated as a warning among newly arrived prisoners. His early escape did not prevent his capture on June 11, 1945. During his imprisonment, he contracted typhoid fever, experiencing for the first time the kind of suffering he had systematically inflicted. The irony was cruel but appropriate. His behavior during the trial revealed a personality that had fully internalized dehumanization. When questioned about his routine, he sarcastically replied, "I was just doing my job. I beat at least 2 prisoners a day." This trivialization of evil proved more disturbing than his outright fanaticism. During the Stutthof trial, she was one of 5 women sentenced to death among 13 defendants. Her sentence was publicly carried out on July 4, 1946, before thousands of witnesses as an exemplary example. Executed in Biskupia Gorka without religious absolution, Wanda completed a transformation that had lasted barely 2 years. From factory worker to war criminal, her case illustrates how extreme circumstances reveal latent capacities for evil in seemingly ordinary people. Gerda Steinhoff, Rise in the Shadows. Gerda Steinhoff was born in 1922 in the Danzig region. During her youth, she worked in domestic jobs, as a farm maid, a cook, and a tram driver. In 1944, she married and had a son, but that same year she decided to join the staff at the Stutthof concentration camp as a supervisor. Through contacts with SS soldiers, she learned that the camp needed female staff. She joined the SK3 women's camp in the summer of 1944, when the camp was experiencing a massive influx of Jewish prisoners evacuated from other territories. Her rise within the system was rapid. Within a few months, she was promoted to Blockleiterin, block leader, and later reached the rank of SS Oberaufseherin, the highest position a woman could achieve in the camp system. On January 25, 1945, she received a decoration from the Third Reich for her service. Survivor accounts describe her as one of the camp's most brutal supervisors. She actively participated in the selection of prisoners for the gas chambers and systematically applied physical punishment. Her behavior was known for both her physical cruelty and her enthusiastic participation in camp activities. Unlike other female supervisors who kept their distance from male staff, Steinhoff fully integrated herself into the SS apparatus, establishing close relationships with officers who provided her with additional protection and influence within the camp. During the final evacuations of the camp in early 1945, he oversaw the transfer of prisoners to other camps and Baltic ports. Documents discovered after the war show his signature on transport orders during these evacuations, many of which proved fatal for the prisoners. She did not flee when the camp's liberation approached. She was arrested on May 25, 1945, by Polish authorities at her home, where she was found without having made any significant efforts to conceal her identity or destroy evidence. During the trial held in Gdansk in 1946, approximately 200 survivors testified against her. Their testimony detailed specific episodes of abuse, torture, and direct participation in the extermination. Evidence included camp documents confirming her role and responsibilities. His attitude during the trial was one of arrogance and lack of remorse. He denied the seriousness of his actions and presented them as the fulfillment of his administrative duties. He showed no signs of remorse throughout the proceedings. The court sentenced her to death for crimes against humanity. The sentence was based on documentary evidence, testimony from multiple survivors, and her proven participation in the camp's extermination operations. On July 4, 1946, Gerda Steinhoff was publicly executed in Biskupia Gorka along with 4 other Stutthof supervisors: Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Ewa Paradis, Elizabeth Becker, and Wanda Klaff. The execution was carried out by hanging using military trucks before a crowd estimated at over 200,000. The execution method consisted of placing the condemned men in the back of military trucks with ropes around their necks. As the trucks moved forward, the bodies were suspended until they died by strangulation. No hoods or methods to hasten death were used. The crowd reacted with hostility toward the executed women. After the executions, some people approached the bodies to take pieces of rope and clothing as souvenirs. The bodies were later taken to the anatomical theater in Danzig for use in medical studies. The Stutthof executions were some of the last public executions to take place in Poland. Steinhoff's case was considered particularly significant due to his high rank within the camp system and the extensive evidence of his active participation in atrocities. Subsequent records confirmed that she had been one of the most efficient supervisors in terms of camp operations, which resulted in a higher number of deaths under her watch. Her case illustrates how individuals without a history of extreme political fanaticism could become active perpetrators of genocide when presented with the right opportunity and context. Their story remains documented in the archives of the Stutthof Museum as an example of female participation in the Nazi extermination machinery and the judicial consequences some perpetrators faced after the war. Herta Botte, impunity after the collapse of the Third Reich. Herta Botte's story is the most disturbing of all, not because of the magnitude of her crimes, but because of her end. While the Stutthof guards were publicly executed in 1946, Botha lived until 2000 as a free citizen in West Germany. Her case illustrates the inconsistencies of post-war justice and raises uncomfortable questions about impunity and historical memory. Her transformation began unexpectedly. Born on January 8, 1921 in Tetterow, Mecklenburg, Herta grew up as an exemplary child, kind, studious, and empathetic. During her adolescence, she volunteered at local hospitals, gaining admiration for her dedication to the sick. Her cabinet-maker father had instilled in her the values of hard work and respect for authority in a conservative Lutheran family. Before becoming involved with the Nazi regime, she worked as an auxiliary nurse in an industrial hospital. Her empathetic demeanor contrasted sharply with the image she would later acquire. Nothing suggested the capacity for brutality she would demonstrate in the camps. The transformation began in 1939 when she joined the League of German Girls. Her youthful idealism, previously channeled toward caring for the sick, was redirected toward a racist worldview. She developed a fervent admiration for Hitler and the strong woman of the Reich model, not just a caregiver, but an active defender of racial supremacy. Between 1940 and 1942, her transformation accelerated. She stood out for her physical strength and iron discipline, qualities that caught the attention of recruiters. In 1942, she was selected for special training at Ravensbrück, where she developed lethal skills, weapons handling, corporal punishment techniques, methods of psychological humiliation, and, crucially, the ability to completely dehumanize prisoners. At the end of 1942, she arrived at Stutthof as a female block supervisor. Her behavior changed radically and immediately. The empathetic young woman became a ruthless figure who imposed authority with blows, shouts, and constant threats. The prisoners nicknamed her the Stutthof sadist, reflecting both her cruelty and her efficiency. His signature method was the use of his Luger pistol, which he constantly carried to threaten and punish arbitrarily. He fired without apparent provocation, viewing these summary executions as exercises of authority. In the most famous case, a mother who tried to protect her daughter was shot in the chest in front of the entire group, setting a precedent of terror that defined his administration in the camp. Survivors' testimonies reveal the systematic nature of her cruelty. Every morning, Herta inspected the barracks like a military commander reviewing troops. Her presence generated absolute silence. The prisoners had learned that any sound could unleash her fury. She walked slowly between the ranks, looking for pretexts to punish. An incorrect posture, a disheveled uniform, a look she considered challenging were enough to provoke blows with the butt of her pistol. Her psychological punishments revealed a mind that had perfected mental torture. She arbitrarily withheld dishes during meals, leaving prisoners without bread or water even in extreme weather conditions. This system of induced starvation weakened victims to the point of being unfit for labor, condemning them to selection for the gas chambers. But Herta had developed further refinements. She forced women to watch while others ate, creating a psychological torture that accompanied the physical suffering. During the long winter months at Stutthof, her methods became even more elaborate. She organized cleanliness inspections where prisoners were required to strip naked in unheated barracks, remaining motionless for hours while she decided who deserved further punishment. Some women died of hypothermia during these sessions, but Herta recorded them as natural deaths due to disease. Her participation in the selections for the gas chambers demonstrated a bureaucratic efficiency that impressed even her male superiors. Unlike other supervisors who displayed a certain degree of emotion during these processes, Herta carried them out with the coolness of someone sorting through an inventory. She reviewed each group of new arrivals meticulously, separating the useful from the useless without showing the slightest hesitation. Camp records show that under her supervision, the rate of shipments to the gas chambers increased significantly. A particularly disturbing aspect of her personality was her ability to alternate between extreme cruelty and seemingly normal behavior. Other staff members described her as a pleasant colleague during meals, able to converse on mundane topics while planning the next day's punishments. This duality suggested not a disturbed mind, but a personality that had completely compartmentalized its actions. In January 1945, when the advance of the Red Army made the evacuation of the camp inevitable, Herta was appointed leader of one of the most brutal death marches, the one that marched prisoners from Stutthof to Bergen-Belsen, briefly passing through Auschwitz. Her selection for this role was no coincidence. Her superiors trusted her ability to maintain discipline during the transfer, even in extreme conditions. The march she led turned into a moving nightmare. For 3 weeks, she led a column of more than 2,000 prisoners through territory controlled by retreating German forces. The weather conditions were devastating. Temperatures dropping to -25°C, roads covered in snow and ice, and winds that slashed like blades. Herta had received provisions for only a week, but authorities expected the march to last at least 3. Her handling of this march revealed new dimensions of her sadism. She established a marching pace that she knew many prisoners would be unable to maintain, especially the weakest and sickest. When someone fell, Herta applied a simple rule: 3 minutes to get up or be shot in the back of the head. There were no exceptions, not even for pregnant women or children accompanying their mothers. During overnight stops, she refused to provide adequate shelter. The prisoners slept outdoors, often in the snow, while Herta and the other guards settled in requisitioned farmhouses. In the mornings, the frozen bodies were simply abandoned by the side of the road. Testimonies indicate that Herta seemed to view these deaths as an efficient way to reduce the number of people under her responsibility. One of the most documented episodes of her cruelty during the march occurred near the town of Marienburg. A group of prisoners had found shelter in an abandoned barn during a particularly severe snowstorm. When Herta discovered this, she ordered them taken outside and forced to stand overnight as punishment for disobedience. More than 30 women died of hypothermia that night. On April 15, 1945, British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen and found Herta still in her SS uniform. Her arrest was immediate, but her behavior during the initial interrogations revealed a personality who did not understand the gravity of her situation. She maintained that she had carried out legitimate military orders and seemed genuinely surprised by the accusations against her. During the trial held in September 1945 at the Belsen Tribunal, she systematically denied all the accusations. Her defense strategy was based on presenting herself as a simple administrative employee who had followed orders without directly participating in violence. She claimed that she had never hit anyone, that her role was purely logistical, and that she had never used her weapon against prisoners. This narrative contrasted dramatically with the testimony of multiple survivors. For several weeks, the court heard detailed accounts of his behavior at Stutthof and during the death marches. Witnesses described his summary executions, his methods of psychological torture, his participation in gas chamber selections, and his cruelty during evacuations. One of the most striking testimonies came from a woman who had been a nurse at the hospital where Herta worked before the war. This witness described the contrast between the empathetic young woman she had known and the cold, implacable woman she had encountered at Bergen-Belsen. "It was as if they were two completely different people," she declared. "The Herta I knew wouldn't have hurt a fly." Despite overwhelming evidence and devastating testimony, the verdict was surprisingly lenient. Herta was sentenced to only 10 years in prison, a sentence that immediately sparked controversy. The difference with the Polish trials was clear. While the death penalty had been applied in Gdansk, British courts seemed more reluctant to execute women, regardless of the gravity of their crimes. This disparity in the administration of justice did not go unnoticed by contemporary observers. Polish media openly criticized what they considered a double standard of justice, where the nationality of the court determined the severity of the punishment, rather than the seriousness of the crimes. For survivors who had testified in both trials, the difference was incomprehensible and painful. The situation became even more problematic when Herta didn't even serve her full sentence. On December 22, 1951, she was released early for humanitarian reasons after serving just 6.5 years in prison. Official documents cited her good behavior in prison and evidence of rehabilitation, but never specified what constituted this rehabilitation. During her incarceration, Herta had kept a low profile. Prison reports described her as a model prisoner. She followed the rules, didn't cause trouble, and participated in work programs. However, she never showed genuine remorse or offered public apologies for her actions. In the few interviews she gave to prison authorities, she maintained that she had been a victim of circumstances and that her actions had been misinterpreted. After her release, Herta strategically changed her identity. She adopted the surname Lang, moved to a small town in West Germany, and began a completely new life. She worked as a domestic worker, then as an assistant at a local bakery, always maintaining an extremely low profile. Her neighbors and employers described her as a quiet, hardworking, and reliable woman. This reinvention was meticulous and successful. For decades, no one around her knew her past. She presented herself as a war widow who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, a story that generated sympathy rather than suspicion. She even developed superficial social relationships, occasionally participating in community and religious activities. The contrast with the fate of her colleagues at Stutthof could not have been more striking. While Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Ewa Paradis, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, and Gerda Steinhoff had been publicly executed before crowds clamoring for justice, Herta lived quietly, enjoying freedoms her victims would never regain. During the 1960s and 1970s, when the world experienced renewed interest in Holocaust crimes, some researchers attempted to locate former perpetrators who had escaped justice. Herta Botha's name occasionally appeared on these lists, but her efforts to change her identity had been so effective that investigators were unable to find any solid clues about her whereabouts. In 1979, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal included Herta Botha's name on a list of wanted war criminals, but by then she had been living under her new identity for nearly 3 decades. German authorities conducted cursory investigations, but the lack of resources dedicated to such cases and institutional resistance to reopening past wounds meant that these efforts remained largely symbolic. Herta's silence during these decades was absolute. Unlike other Nazi criminals who occasionally granted interviews or published exculpatory memoirs, she maintained a strict policy of total invisibility. She refused any contact with the media, historians, or researchers. Even when former prisoners who had identified her attempted to contact her through intermediaries, she never responded. Her death in 2000, at the age of 79, went virtually unnoticed. Official records identified her as Herta Lange, a retired domestic worker, with no mention of her past. She was buried in a municipal cemetery under her assumed identity, and only years later did researchers confirm that she was indeed the former Stutthof supervisor. For the few survivors still alive in 2000, the news of her peaceful death represented a final injustice. They had hoped for decades that she would face new charges, that she would be forced to confront her past, that she would at least express some kind of acknowledgement about the suffering she had caused. Instead, she died as she had lived for more than 5 decades, anonymously, unpunished, without remorse.